This is a Best in Climate episode of Earth Feels, where each week your hosts Rose and Christine read to you from some of the best climate-related blogs and articles on the web.
Hi, it's Rose here with this week's Best in Climate. Today, the IPCC dropped a devastating report where it states irrevocably that the impacts of global warming are now unavoidable. In my humble opinion, we are standing at the crossroads between hope and despair. So today, I want to ask you to choose hope. This week's reading is entitled The Case for Climate Optimism, written by Richard Matthews, who you will remember we have used for 4 prior episodes, both interviews and for Best in Climate. I'll provide the links on our corresponding webpage for this episode. Richard writes an incredible newsletter called The Green Market Oracle, which offers me, as a climate activist, some very needed hope in these uncertain times. As always, the most important thing that we can each do to mitigate this existential crisis is to talk about what's happening. But please practice good self-care as you digest today's UN report. I hope that this excellent article from Richard's newsletter will help counterbalance some of the anxiety that today's UN report is certain to bring up in all of us. Again, Richard Matthews, The Case for Climate Optimism. The state of the climate is indeed perilous, but contrary to the prevailing pessimistic narratives, we have seen major improvements since the signing of the Paris Accord. This includes climate declarations around the world, the climate advocacy of young activists like Greta Thunberg, and mass public protests. We have witnessed the proliferation of climate groups like the Sunrise Movement and Extinction Rebellion. We have seen leadership from countries around the world: Sweden, the UK, Denmark, Norway, Morocco, and Chile. In the US, politicians like Washington Governor Jay Inslee promoted the Green New Deal and drove climate change to the top of the agenda in the US Democratic primaries. The election of President Joe Biden in 2020 also represents a major improvement for global efforts to address the climate crisis. The rapid rise in environmental, social, and good governance priorities are optimistic signs that signal a change in thinking is taking place in both governments and businesses. This is the view of Gaia Harrington, the Sustainability and Dynamic System Analysis Lead at KPMG in the US. From energy to efficiency, we are seeing reasons for optimism. The fossil fuel industry is increasingly under siege from the courts, investors, banks, and insurers. We are consistently outpacing projections for installed renewable energy development, and electric vehicles will soon be mainstream. There are even hopeful advances that bode well for the future of high carbon industries like steel and concrete. The case for optimism is being made by climate scientists like Michael Mann, Katherine Hayhoe, and Andrea Dutton. It is also the central premise of an article entitled More Reasons for Optimism Than We Have Seen in 2 Decades by climate experts Gabby Mokata and Rebecca Harris. They describe what they call a groundswell of change, and they point to global polls that show almost 2/3, 64%, of respondents considered the climate crisis a global emergency, and more than 2,800 scientists and 1,990 jurisdictions in 34 countries have formally made similar declarations. In a Guardian article, Rebecca Solnit has also made the case for climate optimism, albeit cautiously. She supports her argument by pointing to the Green New Deal as well as advances in science and technology, e.g., energy storage. She cites optimistic projections, including the prediction that there will be 145 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030. She explains that just because the change is hard to envision does not mean it is not possible. Quote, that we cannot see all the way to the transformed society we need does not mean it is impossible. We will reach it not by one great leap, but by a long journey, step by step. If we see how impossible our current reality might have seemed 20 years ago, that solar would be so cheap, that Scotland would get 97% of its electricity from renewables, that fossil fuel corporations would be in free fall, we can trust that we could be moving toward an even more transformed and transformative future, and that it is not a set destination, but for better or for worse, we are making it up as we go. Each shift makes more shifts possible, but only if we go actively toward the possibilities rather than passively into the collapse. End quote. Combating despair with action. It is understandably hard to hope when recent history offers us a plethora of reasons to despair. In the US, the GOP has succeeded in delaying climate action. Their toxic combination of science denial and racism culminated in lies, coup attempts, and insurrection under the leadership of the former president. Perhaps even more concerning is the fact that a large minority of people continue to support the failed presidency and dismal legacy of President Biden's predecessor. Even more concerning is the GOP's ongoing efforts to sell the big lie of election fraud and foment authoritarianism through voter suppression. While it is often hard to see as it is unfolding, sometimes good things come from bad. Trump and COVID are good illustrations of tragedies that may contribute to a better world. As paradoxical as this may seem, recent events offer valuable lessons to anyone who is receptive to the facts. Even the deadly coronavirus may have a silver lining. While it is yet uncertain that we will learn from COVID-19, there is reason to believe that the pandemic may augur hope for climate action and may help to herald a paradigm change. Just as we value life more in the face of death, we may come to value democracy and truth more now that they have been under attack. Perhaps we will also value our planet more now that a significant majority of the world has acknowledged the perilousness of our situation. Jeff Goodall, a contributor to Covering Climate Now, a global collaboration of more than 250 news outlets, made the case for hope in 2019. When Goodall wrote his piece, the world was on fire and awash with floods. And 2 years later, we are experiencing more of the same. Quote, "It's not easy to feel hopeful at this dark hour," Goodall wrote. He nonetheless pointed to the protesters and the politicians that are stepping up and fighting for the future we want. Goodall thinks we may have finally acknowledged the extent of the threat and summoned the moral courage to act. He also made the following optimistic prediction for 2029. Quote, "When the climate revolution is fully underway and Miami Beach real estate prices are in free fall due to constant flooding, and internal combustion engines are as dead as CDs, people will look back on the fall of 2019 as the turning point in the climate crisis. At the very least, it will be remembered as the moment that it became clear that people are not going to give up their future on a habitable planet without a damn good fight." End quote. Goodall wrote his piece before the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. A strong argument could be made in support of the view that the combination of the deadly iteration of the coronavirus and the former American president has exposed the fault lines of a broken civilization that may impel us to act on multiple fronts. Rather than lead to apathy and avoidance, despair and uncertainty can augur action and give us reasons to hope. Ben Piven is another writer who has made the case for hope. He acknowledges that climate change can be overwhelming, but he adds, quote, "Those of you who fear it's too late to change the planet's fortunes, take heart, because some experts think humanity can still turn things around for Mother Earth." End quote. A study conducted by Harrington finds that technological progress and increased investments in public services could avert the risk of collapse and lead to a new stable and prosperous civilization operating safely within planetary boundaries. Harrington points to the rapid rate at which we developed vaccines for COVID-19 as an illustration of human capabilities. Quote, "The necessary changes will not be easy and pose transition challenges, but a sustainable and inclusive future is still possible." Stubborn optimism and the fierce urgency of now. 14,000 scientists recently signed a declaration warning that we are in the midst of a global climate emergency, and they warned us of untold suffering if we ignore climate change. This is consistent with a large body of scientific evidence that clearly calls for urgent action. While there is still time to avert a climate catastrophe, we are running out of time. We are an often irrational species, so it is far from a foregone conclusion that we will do what we must within the time we have. As explained by Mark Carney, those who fail to heed the call to action will fail. However, government and corporate leaders who drag their feet to protect their short-term financial interests could take us all down with them. We don't have the time to wait for them to wake up. As Bill McKibben said, quote, "Winning slowly on climate change is losing," end quote. We know what must be done, but to do it, we must marshal popular support that will unlock the political will to act at the required scale. The effort to address this threat is emboldened by the hope that we can succeed, the belief that we can accomplish something meaningful, i.e., avert the collapse of civilization, is not merely wishful thinking. It reflects the best science we have. It also contributes to building the critical mass we require. It takes more courage to hope for a better world. As Greta said, quote, "Hope requires action." Christiana Figueres is an advocate of stubborn optimism, which she sees as a catalyst for action and change. Figueres was Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and she was instrumental in the signing of the Paris Climate Accord in 2015. She has expressed an unshakable determination to fight for the generations that will come after us, and she urges everyone to envision and work for the future they want for humanity. She recently spoke of the urgency of collective action, saying, quote, "This decade is a moment of choice unlike anything we have ever lived. All of us alive right now share that responsibility and that opportunity. The optimism I'm speaking of is not the result of achievement. It is the necessary input to meeting a challenge. Many now believe it is impossible to cut global emissions in half in this decade. I say we don't have the right to give up or let up." End quote. And as Greta wrote on Twitter, we need to stop focusing on dates and numbers and actually accept and acknowledge the fact that we need to reduce our emissions right now. We can talk about 2030 or 2040 as much as we want, but it is what we are doing now that really matters. We are likely to blow past 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial temperature norms. But with a concerted effort, we can stay below 2 degrees. And over time, we may be able to siphon enough carbon out of the atmosphere to get back down to the 1.5. Man is among those who believe we will. Quote, "I'm committed to the belief that there will be a moment, perhaps not in the too distant future, where the political winds writ large will be more favorable. I think at that point, We will see the tipping point on climate action because the groundwork has been laid. The scientific case is compelling. Nature is compelling. Nature is communicating the profound impacts of climate change directly to us, and that means we'll be able to hit the ground running, man said last summer. There is reason to believe that we may finally do what needs to be done. However, the urgency for immediate climate action cannot be overstated. It's now or never. This is our last chance. If we do not do what we must in the coming years, it will be too late. We are faced with a stark choice between the path of hope or the path of surrender. The road ahead is arduous and uncertain, but we do not have the right to succumb to pessimism. Stubborn optimism is only a down payment on the debt we owe to future generations. So there you have it. Reasons to be optimistic. This is our all hands on deck moment. Process what you need to process. Grieve what you need to grieve. But come back stronger and willing to fight. Everyone is needed. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you next time. Stay hopeful.
That's this week's episode of Best in Climate for Earth Feels.
Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me.